My name is Tal Kitron with Appleroot Tutoring Services. We're going to be talking today about the SAT versus ACT, some of the differences, and then we'll look at testing timelines and college applications and recent expectations. Closed captioning you should see is enabled. You can also click out of that. If you have questions throughout today, I don't anticipate this taking the full hour, although pretty close to it, but we'll get out within the hour. Please feel free, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. And without further ado, let's get started. So Appleroot has three fundamental cornerstones. I work primarily as a tutor. So for test prep, SAT, ACT, PSAT, that's how I got some of the background for what we're going to be talking about today. We also do academic tutoring. So for in-school tests or just class, and then executive function coaching, which is also something I've recently started doing. And to begin, I just want to put testing, ACT, SAT, college entrance exams into a little bit of context. This is from a 2019 survey, but the numbers hold true. And what you can see here is that when talking about college admissions and applications, testing is only part of the picture, and it's not even the biggest part. You can see that SAT and ACT scores are up there, right, as listed as either considerable or moderate in terms of their influence on colleges' decisions to admit or not admit, but they're secondary to grades and even in a lot of cases to academic rigor. So test scores don't define us. We're to talk about test optional schools and what that means. Just know that although it can definitely be a feather in the cap, it can really help you get in places, get you scholarship money, and change your application portfolio. It isn't the be all end all, especially these days. So just putting things in context as we talk about the SAT and ACT, these college entrance exams. Major differences are the SAT is more rigorous. There's more critical thinking when it comes to the verbal, so the reading and the writing sections. And then on the flip side, the ACT is a lot more rigorous when it comes to the STEM. There's a science section. The math is harder, just tests more challenging material in general. But that being said, there's a ton of overlap. What you can see is they have about 80%. They both tests are going to test you on reading skills, so that's comprehension, standard English conventions and rhetoric skills. Interpreting graphs on the ACT, that's the science section. On the SAT, that comes in the reading and the writing and the math and everywhere. And they'll both have some algebra, a little bit of stats like mean and median and mode, and some geometry and trig. The ACT will have more of that, right? More advanced math, more advanced science, more trig and random math. And the SAT will just be more challenging when it comes to reading, wordier word problems on all sections. And not only do they overlap with content a great deal, the structure of these tests for right now, quite similar. We can see that the SAT goes reading first. It's the longest section. It's kind of nice to get that over with first. That's followed by section 2, writing, and then 2 math sections. One of which you get a calculator, one of which you don't. And the ACT is English, then math, then reading, then science. Those last 2 sections are a big time crunch, which is really hard, especially because they're the last 2. The SAT has done away with the essay portion, no longer exists. The ACT still has it. You can pay to take it, but there's so few colleges that require it that it's really not worth it anymore. And then sometimes people will see a section 5 and be like, oh my gosh, my tutor didn't tell me about that. I always try to warn students about that. It's just gathering data for future tests, so it doesn't count towards your score of 1600 or 36. So the experimental section is just for College Board or ACT to gather data for future exams. Here's the biggest difference between the 2 tests. You can see, so like because reading and science on ACT are 60, like math is 60 minutes, 60 questions. Reading and science are 40 questions in 35 minutes. So more questions than actual minutes you have. The SAT won't ever do that. So it's a lot more forgiving on timing, but it's because it's a bit more challenging, right? So to paint a broad brush, if a student is really struggling on math, but great with the verbal, the SAT is probably the right test. And then vice versa, the opposite applies. You can see like less than a minute per question on almost every section of ACT, whereas on SAT, that's not really the case. The biggest area of divergence between these two tests is the math sections. The SAT focuses on algebra. I say know a lot about a little. Common Core Math, Algebra 1, Algebra 2, lines, functions, Y and X. The ACT, 60 questions in 60 minutes, and it's just a grab bag. Know a little bit about a lot. So the ACT is more like, hey, do you remember matrices? There's a point. Remember dealing with logarithms? Here's another point, right? So a lot of people will just have forgotten things. So the ACT math can be harder to prepare for in that sense. Just to delve into the math comparison a bit more. The SAT has a no calc section, section 3. That scares some people. Both sections on SAT also have grid-ins or free response questions, which the ACT never has. The SAT, again, is building on the same concept over and over again, like intercepts and just X and Y stuff, whereas the ACT, it'll kind of come out of nowhere. They'll ask you about like math vocabulary. There's a bunch of concepts. On ACT math, there are actually 5 multiple choice answers, which is the only section from either SAT or ACT that has more than 4. So it's usually just A, B, C, D. On ACT math, it's A, B, C, D, F. The only other thing I'll say about this is that the ACT doesn't have any grid-ins, and you also get the calculator the whole time. So very important to know how to use a graphing calculator. But it's nice that there's always multiple choice. So worst case scenario, we can guess E or K, right, which is the last answer choice. Here's some more breakdowns. This is from years worth of official SATs and ACTs. Biggest takeaway here is the SAT is very algebra heavy. So we established that. There's going to be stuff about statistics, basic stats on both tests. SAT kind of does test that a lot. And although the SAT provides formulas for geometry, they almost never test it, whereas the ACT does not provide formulas and test geometry all the time. Annoying. Some things you could see on ACT math, just to show how expansive it is. We'd want to know how to do matrices in the calculator. Just remember what they are. Knowing the basic formulas of equation of a circle and ellipses and hyperbolas for the toughest of the tough questions. Range and domain, asymptotes and holes, unit circle stuff, vocab like what is a monomial factor, right, or an acute triangle, and then certain properties of math as well. So things that we haven't thought about for years, if ever. The first move for almost everyone should be to take both tests. You can get those, I think, for free or very cheaply through Appleroot, or you can, honestly, there's free tests online for both SAT and ACT. Take a full timed mock test for each, and then figure out which is the better test for you, which one's the stronger score, right? If there isn't a stronger score and they're very equivalent, then which one did you like better? On a rare occasion, I've worked with thousands of students over the years, sometimes it's just not working. Like we take a couple official tests and for some reason the SAT just isn't clicking. Student gets getting frustrated and we're not seeing the progress we'd expect from tutoring. In that rare instance, you can switch to ACT. So it's better to focus on one test and one test only. But if you have to switch, remember most of it transfers and sometimes people just need a fresh start. But usually take the baselines, pick a test and focus only on that. Right? If we're going to SAT, we're only focusing SAT, ACT, we're just doing ACT. There are easy ways to concord SAT and ACT scores. You can compare your baseline mocks. You can also use your PSAT. And the SAT website has started to put PSAT questions on the website. So if you are a student or a parent, you can actually log into the College Board account and actually see every PSAT question that that student missed sophomore and junior year, maybe even freshman year for some. That being said, when you take your practice tests, SAT, ACT, if the difference isn't major, again, just go with what you liked better. Really, if it feels like, man, I didn't like the SAT much, the reading was really hard. ACT is a time crunch, but I like that it's a bit simpler. Boom, right? We're always going to do better with what we like. So I'll trust my student on that decision if it's a close call. We'll also talk about timeline and how the tests are in different months. So that can also affect it if you're an athlete or if you're in a play, right? If you need to plan around certain months, maybe that'll affect which test you pursue. Once we decide on SAT versus ACT, you want to plan for 2 or 3 official tests, register for them, and then that's how you plan tutoring, right? So when I get assigned a student, we'll look at which tests we're registered for, make sure that they're registered, and then we'll schedule by working backwards from the test date to plan sessions to keep confidence momentum going into that test, making sure we got practice tests and distributed work over the course of several months. I've had students who have taken the test once and gotten a great score and been done, but it's very rare. It puts undue pressure, right? You don't want to do that because if you think, man, I got to take this test and get this 1400 score I need, it's better. You're better off if you think, well, I've got more cracks at it, right? Treat this like almost a practice run that takes some pressure off, and that's when you often see the best scores. It takes most students also 3 official tests to reach full potential. And as far as which tests to take, there are some myths. So just to dispel those notions, there is not like a typical test date for SAT or ACT that is better, right? So you're not going to say, oh, well, the May test, the curve was really rough, so the June test is going to be better. That's not how it works. There's no rhyme or reason. You should pick tests based on your own schedule, not on rumors of which test is going to be easier or more generous as far as the curve. Varies from year to year, no evidence of any sort of pattern. So August is going to be greater than a curve, just like May, just like June, just like December. Whether you decide on SAT versus ACT, there are certainly elements to successful test prep. Number 1 is mock tests, so early and often, not burnout often, but every 4 to 6 hours of tutoring or every month, you want to take a mock test to measure progress. Those are also the best resources. Not only does it give you good timed practice in the testing environment, but like you and or a tutor can go over the actual results. And that's how I'd always start a first session. Like, let's work through the questions you missed on this practice test. That'll show us what to focus on going forward. Fix some mistakes right away. You want to start early and distribute your practice. So meaning a lot of students start test prep junior year. That's the most common, is like fall of junior year, sometimes spring. Advanced students sometimes start after sophomore year in the summer. You want to have all your tests done really by like September, October, at latest November of your senior year, fall semester. But the more time you spend on tasks, the more you space things out instead of trying to cram. These aren't tests you can cram for. These are tests of effort. So spending time on tasks, finishing strong, which is why I work backwards, always leading in with confidence and momentum. And then setting a goal, right? Everyone's going to be different, but you want to set kind of a high goal and work towards that with benchmark goals along the way. Right? Seeing those little successes in terms of mock tests or just even homework can help students a lot. And you can just see them just grow in confidence and then performance because of that. So here would be a version of a highly simplified plan if we were just starting out with test prep. First is we are deciding on ACT, SAT, and we're looking at the schedules of tests. So the next test, for example, for the SAT is coming up on Saturday, but the next test people could register for is June 3rd. If someone started prep today, I think June 3rd would be like pretty early, that's like a month, right? It's not really as much time as we'd like for the first test, but it's doable. More realistic would be wait until school ends, right? Start mid-June or after vacation in July, and then prepare for the August, October, and November SATs. Or maybe we're ready in early June, we prepare for the July ACT, September ACT, October ACT. You can space them out more, but in my experience, it's better to take tests back to back or back to back to back. There's minor advantages to March, May, and October SATs. You can get the questions back like 10 days later, which is cool. They release those tests. But just kind of knowing what the schedule is and then what your extracurriculars and what your school schedule will be like. Right? That's the most important thing to plan around other than just which test are we pursuing. So thinking specifically about SAT, what has changed? Big change is the subject tests are gone. This is since 2021. So when I was growing up, there were things called subject tests that were at the end of the year. You could get college credit for elite schools. A lot of them required a couple subject tests. They were a big pain. They were difficult. And just added to the end of year stress, junior and senior year. The writing portion is also completely gone. We touched on that, but there's no more essay. Colleges are now focusing more on personal statements, recommendations, and essays on the application. I'm gonna leave this up for a moment. This is an important slide. And the SAT is changing. So it's going digital starting in March of next year. That's 2024. That will affect current sophomores. So that'll be rising juniors next year. Current juniors will not be affected by this change. So if you're going to be a rising senior in this fall, you're going to be taking the paper tests, ideally before the end of the year. The biggest changes with the digital test. So I started working on this a lot with international students where the changes already taken effect. And it's all computer-based. It's also adaptive, meaning if you do well on the first module of verbal, the next one will be harder. If you don't do as well and there's some questions that are tougher and we struggle, you'll get an easier module. So you'll have a lower maximum score, but questions more in your range. The big difference is, besides the fact that it's just on the computer, it's shorter, 2 hours, not more like 3. It's even more now than the SAT, there's more time per question. There are no long reading passages. In fact, there's no more than one question per passage, believe it or not. So lots of short passages and little analytical questions. More topics. So I've noticed vocab, I've noticed graph interpretation, poetry, like sentence completion, punctuation, all sorts of stuff like that. Synthesizing facts. No more no-calc section. There are still free response, but no more no-calc. You can use a calculator throughout. And in fact, some students and parents may be familiar with Desmos, which is like a computer-based graphing calculator. There's actually a built-in version of that on the digital test, along with formulas you can pull up, and you can bring your own calculator as well. It's still at a 1600. So there's 800 available points on math, 800 on verbal. And one thing we should see domestically when it changes is more in-school tests. So beyond these dates that we saw here, the March, May, October, all those, we'll probably see more like April school day tests and probably same in October or November. There's going to be, I think, more schools offering those Saturday tests or even Wednesday tests where students can take it in their actual classroom or in their school, which is nice. So that's a huge change. If there's questions about that, throw them in the Q&A. We'll get to those at the end. And then what's happening with ACT? Well, many years ago, at this point, it had to be like 4 or 5 years ago, they announced that they were changing to digital and also said, we're going to now allow people to retake the tests and only do math or only do science or do one section at a time, which would have been awesome because we'll talk about super scoring and it would have really just been a great advantage for ACT test takers. I don't see any indication that these are imminent. Computer-based is internationally, that's happening. So the international students have been taking computer-based ACT for a while now, but we don't know. So for now, ACT is going to stay on paper. If you are a sophomore and you're thinking about starting prep this summer, what I might consider is focusing on ACT, only because the SAT is changing from paper to digital over the next year. And so like, if you're not happy with your SAT score fall of junior year, then you may be in trouble if you have to switch to digital SAT. The one nice thing about ACT, among other nice things, is it's predictable. It's the paper test right now. It's those same 4 sections in the same order. And Applewood will be ahead of the game when it comes to the digital SAT, but it is going to be a huge change. It's a different test. What super scoring is if you take multiple tests in different sittings. So you take like the June and July ACT, or in this case, April, September, December. ACT will automatically super score your tests, meaning you can see here, these are the highest section scores across multiple test dates. So maybe in September, this person didn't score as well on science. In April, they got below a 13 on English. But for colleges that super score the ACT, which is about half at least, they will only see this. They won't see how many times you took it. They'll just see your highest composite score. That is a big reason to take the test more than once, and maybe even more than twice. And I think that's confusing. So just to lay it out one bit more is if you took an ACT in June, and let's say you got an English score of 25, a math score of 26, a reading score of 23, and a science score of 20. And that's your June score. But then we took the test again in July. And English went up because we worked on that a lot. The math went down because we're not in school mode. And reading went up because we worked on that a lot. But science was the same. Again, super scoring wise, in colleges that super score, which is a lot of them, you'd have to check when you apply if they do, would only see this. So even though the composite for each of these is probably more like a 25, when you average out these scores, it's closer to a 27 because we only see the highest scores from multiple sittings. Big advantage of taking the test more than once in this case. So now I think getting into the stuff that I think is more interesting and different over the past few years, and also really impactful when it comes to college apps. For some of you, that's imminent, that's on the horizon. For others, it's a bit down the road. My goal is to reduce stress and not make you anxious about it. So that's the goal of this part of the presentation. And we're just going to break down how colleges right now, how admissions offices are working. So when the COVID pandemic hit, a lot of SAT and ACT centers were just canceled. It was impossible for students to take tests for obvious reasons across the country and the world. And some students were able to take them. A lot of times they kept test centers open until the last couple of days, and then they would cancel the test center and leave the person kind of out of luck. In response, vast majority of colleges and universities said for at least the 2020-21 admission cycle, they were going to go test optional. So whereas before they might require you to send an SAT or ACT score with your application, pretty much everyone went test optional. You can send it, but you don't have to. You can still get in without. These are the 4 types of admissions policies when it comes to SAT, ACT. So the dominant position pre-pandemic was test required. Most schools required you to submit an SAT or ACT. Simple as that. There were some schools that were test optional. That's now the dominant position. We'll talk about that. And then there's test blind, which means not only is it optional, they won't look at your test. So you can't send a test score. And then test flexible, which doesn't really exist anymore. So we won't really talk about that. The big ones though are test required and test optional. After the pandemic, since the pandemic has kind of slowed, some states, especially in the South of the United States, have started to require the ACT and SAT again. Meaning if you apply to UGA, there is no test optional pool anymore. You have to submit a score if you apply to UGA or any of the Georgia state schools. Same within North Carolina. I believe that they delayed it, but I think it's now in action. In Florida, right? So like in the South in particular, a lot of schools, big schools, have gone back to test required. Same with some of these elite schools like Georgetown and MIT. But there've also been some highly selective colleges that have kind of said, well, no, we're going to keep going with test optional. What that means is some students are going to apply to this college with test scores. They're going to take the SAT, ACT, they're going to include it on their application. And then some won't. And the application will be considered complete at these schools, even if you haven't submitted a score. And if you did submit a score, they'll look at it, they'll consider it. And if you didn't, you're in a separate pool and they'll consider other stuff a little bit more heavily. It used to be about 1,000, and now it's like almost 2,000. So more than 3/4 of all American colleges and universities are now test optional. And I mean, SAT and ACT are as big as ever, so most people don't even know this. But like that's 3/4 of schools where you can apply and get in without taking the ACT or SAT ever, or taking it and thinking, oh, this score doesn't help me. It seems like this position is remaining. So the SAT and ACT are still big things, right? I'm still tutoring every day on that stuff, internationally and domestically. But some people are realizing, oh, the testing isn't for me. I should put my time into other stuff. And so that this test optional option is really crucial for a lot of people. Opens doors that maybe wouldn't have been open otherwise. On the Common App, as of I think this was last admission cycle, only 5% of schools require SAT or ACT submission. You can see most of those are ones we've talked about. So schools in the South, Georgia Tech, Georgetown, we said MIT. I don't think that's a Common App one though. And then military academies. All the rest are test optional. This was a survey kind of near the beginning of the pandemic. So I think 2019, I want to say. And the estimate was that like around now, so by 2024, 2025, there'd be about 20 or 30% of schools that would be test required, and most of the rest would be test optional. It actually seems like more than 60 to 70% are test optional, and fewer are test required. It's probably more like 80, 15, and 5. So the estimates were bullish, but actually it's been exceeded. And I think a big reason for that is a lot of colleges just weren't sure what to do. So like conditions still aren't totally normal. And yes, now the tests are back and test centers are open and all that. But I think that a lot of schools are still waiting to see what will the effects be of going test optional, right? Will the results actually be better? Will we produce a better student body and graduates and alumni? So we're going to see, I think we're already seeing some, but a lot of the data remain hidden. They don't want to make any big permanent decisions. So like we'll see what Harvard did, but we don't want to make big permanent decisions until we see more data and what's happening with test optional. Is it improving our pool of students, or is it making it worse, or is it about the same? Right, and that'll impact their decision of whether they need to bring back test required or eliminate the testing or just stay test optional. It's been harder for them to predict because there have been more people applying to schools because some don't require tests. And so then it's harder to see, okay, well, how many do we accept? Because not everyone who gets accepted comes in. There's a lot of complex decision-making that goes in. And again, we talked about the South. A lot of them have test scores tied to merit aid. So like you can get great financial scholarships just with a decent, not even amazing test score. and certain GPA requirements. Like Florida never stopped, Georgia brought it back, North Carolina brought it back. So you're going to see that happen some more places, but again, mostly in the South for right now, this test required. A lot of colleges have followed Harvard's lead, which was they're going to stay test optional at least for several more years. They're going to get this full graduating class from the beginning of the COVID years and look for what was different about these people who did submit test scores and the ones who got in without. Right? Of course, they're accepting people with great backgrounds and GPAs and all that. And then are all these people who are getting 1600s, 1590s, perfect 36s and getting into Harvard, are they really achieving like higher achievers than the students who got in with the 4.0 but no test score? That'll be very interesting to see. I don't really know. So a lot of colleges are staying test optional again, just so they can figure out more. Now, as a tutor, I mean, I was a little bit concerned at the beginning. Obviously, there are problems with the testing industry. It's not the perfect way by any means to measure skill or intelligence at all, but it pays my bills. So I was a bit worried, hey, when these changes come, and all these schools go test optional, will it go away? And it really hasn't. I mean, it's still incredibly competitive for better and worse. You're going to see the majority of students who are applying, but also the majority of students who get in are still submitting test scores. All right, so if you're test optional, most applicants are still submitting test scores, right? It's just old habits die hard. Those colleges, I mean, standardized test scores are predictors of student success. They're not perfect by any means. Test blind schools are the ones that won't consider test scores at all, and that's pretty rare. But like I think the UC system in California no longer accepts tests. So it's not just test optional, they won't even look at your SAT, ACT. Here are some schools that went from test blind right after COVID really hit, and then some that just made the move to we're going permanently test blind. You can see the UC system there. So these are all schools like Washington State. These are schools that if you apply to, not only do you not have to submit a score, you can't. There's no spot for it. Couple things about not submitting test scores. So what's the impact of that? Well, one big one is that a lot of schools consider test scores when they give merit-based scholarships. Some examples would be Alabama, especially for out of state, because the tuition is quite a bit more for out of state. But if you have a pretty high ACT score, 27, right? That's like probably 88th percentile or something like that, or the equivalent SAT score, and a good GPA, you can get a guaranteed merit scholarship of $8,000 per year, right? And as your scores go up, there's a sliding scale there, right? The presidential one, right? You get a 32 and you get a 3.8 GPA, and then all of a sudden you're only paying a couple thousand a year for college, right? So some schools, and that's why some of the schools in the South are test required, because the merit aid's so tied in historically. Here's a couple others. And so these are schools where, again, if you've got this certain threshold of GPA and test scores that hit a certain level, right, and they've got these different ranges for different schools and different scholarships, you can guarantee yourself. So like when you get into that school, you can guarantee yourself that merit scholarship. One of the big ones in Georgia that people who've grown up there definitely know about is Zell Miller and then the Hope Scholarship. So this has gotten much, much harder to get over the years, just like UGA has gotten much, much harder to get into. It's a great school. But if you can graduate with a minimum 3.7 GPA, you get this SAT score or ACT score in the 1200 range. And you have to, when you get into school, you have to keep a GPA above 3.3, where you lose the scholarship. But those scores, I mean, they're good scores, but they're not world beating, right? Like 26 is probably 70th, 65th percentile nationally, right? It's not like a perfect score. And in Georgia and certain states, you can get amazing merit scholarships just because you took the test and you got that score, right? So that's one good reason. And ironically, I guess, the fact that everyone went test optional actually made application numbers go crazy at selective schools. So, think about a Stanford, where the joke is they're trying to get their admission rate down to 0, because it's always like 0.8% or something of people who applied. Imagine all these people who are like, well, I don't have the test scores to get into Stanford, but all of a sudden now Stanford's test optional. And so I'm going to shoot my shot, right? I've got the GPA, I've got a cool backstory. I've done crew, I've been president of the student body, right? All this stuff. And right, that's huge. And I think that in this test optional pool now for these elite schools, there were more people getting in. So it obviously just changed the dynamic a ton, and it made it harder for admissions offices because there's getting so many more people applying, but hard to know how many they should admit, because not everyone who gets in is going to come. Because of that, some trends we've seen are longer wait lists, although more people getting off of wait lists than I've ever seen before. So like the getting on a wait list for school is no longer like oh no, I didn't get in. It's more like, oh, I might get in. Early decision and early action has been a huge difference maker. These early decision and early action deadlines are like November 1st, November 15th. That's as opposed to the regular deadlines that are more like December, January, beyond. So many people now are applying early decision, early action because they know that they've got a better chance at admission if they get 2 cracks at applying. You can apply early and then you can apply regular if you don't get in. And also just more and more schools are accepting students early decision because they know that those students will come. They're actually making a commitment to come if you apply early action. So if you do that and you've applied to like UGA early decision, what happens is that means if you get in like in late November or December, you're committing to go there. That way they know their numbers a bit better, right? And then the admissions offices can plan accordingly. You can see test optional in the past few years has made some of these selective colleges become even more so. Duke has basically doubled, or I guess halved their admission rate. In 2019, 11.4% of applicants got in. Then 2 years ago, it was more like 6%. Emory's gone down from 20-ish% to 13%, right? So these are some pretty major schools that have seen some big admission rate cuts because more people are applying. Same amount of people are getting in. And I think this is really compelling. Estimated percentage of class filled. So the freshman class is more than half filled by the end of November with early action, early decision for schools like Emory and Penn and Dartmouth and Tulane and Duke, right? That's over half the class is filled. That means there's far fewer spots when you're applying regular decision, right? And more people are also in that pool. So early decision, early action, those are deadlines to certainly keep in mind. When you're thinking about testing timeline, we'd love to be done by November of senior year. I think this is also important. If you take the baseline tests, and maybe you even do some test prep on your own or with a tutor or in a group or online or whatever, and you take a couple official tests and you realize, oh, I'm not improving, or man, I really don't like testing. It's not for me. I'm not doing well. I feel like my time is better served elsewhere. I'm going to go test optional. Just understand that that is an option. Like just, you can do that if you're not, if the testing is just sucking time and energy, it's not for everyone. If you do apply test optional, there are some things they're going to look more closely at. Your strength of schedule, your GPA, your depth of activity and persistence, both academically and extracurricularly. Other testing, meaning AP exams usually, or other benchmarks. Personal statements are going to be more important if you don't have test scores. So in that pool, they'll just be looking more closely at those and putting more emphasis. And same with personal letters of recommendation. So there is a bit of a disadvantage to applying test optional because if you don't submit a test score, just by the numbers, you're a bit less likely to get in. And again, this could be a good thing for some, but this extra emphasis on other parts of your application, right? That's more emphasis that can be a more critical view if you have holes or gaps in there. Now, test submitters are down. I think a lot of that is strategic submission, but you can see from 2020 to 2022, pretty significant, right? Cut like down by 25%. And then I think because a lot of male students, more male than female, are going STEM route, so that's science or math or technology or engineering, there is a bit of difference by major and by focus. So more male students are submitting test scores than female students on average by the Common App, because maybe the test scores are a bit more important for those engineering programs or math programs. So just some interesting trends. And I mentioned this term strategic submission. This is the biggest thing that's different now, because I remember when I was applying to college, I didn't have these decisions. It was like, you apply to the colleges, you send your scores, and that's it. You hope it's good enough. And that's pre-pandemic how it was. More recently, in the past few years, a quarter and probably now more of people chose to submit test scores. They took the ACT or SAT, got their scores, and decided, okay, well, I am going to submit to Fordham, but I'm not going to submit this to Rutgers, right? Or I am going to submit this to Miami, Ohio, but not to Ohio State. And we'll look at like how you would choose whether to submit or not, but I think that's where college counselors come into play, right? Of course, if you have a good tutor and they know their stuff, they can give you advice, but really college counselor, that's their domain. And it can be a really hard decision, because if you're right on the cusp of, does this score help me or not, you got to decide, should I submit or should I leave it out, right? Which makes me look better to this school. Here are just some more numbers. And what you can see here is that whether it was a private school or a public school, test score submissions were down. Makes sense. You go test optional, not everyone will submit an SAT or ACT score. So we are definitely seeing this become a huge trend where people are applying to colleges without SAT, ACT, which I think is great, right? It gives more diverse, intellectually and just actual diversity. I think it's a good way for colleges to not focus on these effort-based standardized curve tests and instead look more at intangibles. Makes it harder for admissions offices for sure. Again, that difference by major. So we see these STEM students trying to show off their math skills with a high SAT math score, ACT math and science. And that's why if you're applying to an engineering program, 75% of people are going to send test scores. Whereas if it's education, right, or social work or something else that's not related to math or science at all, liberal arts, something or other, many fewer applicants will submit test scores. Many more will go test optional. Right, so those discrepancies are just based on major. That's been an interesting new thing. And then, I answered this, do test score submitters have an edge? The answer is yes, right? It's not like if you don't submit a test score, you're done for. But certainly the numbers show, yes, test score submitters for SAT, ACT do have an edge on college applications and admissions. Because colleges have stopped reporting this data, this is from 2020. And here's just some kind of major schools. We'll look at Emory as an example. For those students who applied in the pool with ACT, SAT scores, 17% of those students got in. For the students who applied without a test, so test optional pool, half that, only 8.6% of those students got in. And you can see those compelling numbers. Like in Vanderbilt, it wasn't a very big advantage to submit test scores, but at UVA, at Georgia Tech, at Emory, at Colgate, it absolutely was. Right, so it's hard to find this data, but the general sense is submitting scores, if they are good when it comes to this particular school, right? So in the range of 50th percentile or above, then we'll submit, and if not, we won't. Bottom line, should I try the test? The answer is almost exclusively yes, you should at least try them. We talked about baseline mocks. First item of business really is get those scores. If you look at like then the ranges, even if it's from a few years ago for a college, so like you want to go to Michigan and you want to see what the score range is and you take a test, maybe you look at that and say, well, shoot, Michigan needs a 1450 and I have a 1300 with no prep. I can do that. Or maybe you think, man, Michigan needs a 1450 and I'm at a 900. I don't know if I can get to a 1450. So either that means we look at different schools or we decide, can I go test optional to Michigan? And then the strategic submission question, right? So this is an unanswerable question unless you look at the individual situation. When I apply to a college, should I send in my ACT or SAT scores? Well, these are the secondary questions. Will the scores add value? And are they something that you want the admissions office to see? Will they say, oh, this makes this person a better candidate to come on campus next year? And again, the other thing to keep in mind, or one other thing is if it is a STEM or business program and you're right on the edge, maybe yes, submit. Students with test scores are getting in at higher rates. So if it's a STEM program, you might lean more towards test submission. Whereas if not, maybe not. Right, so if it's like a music major, test score slightly below average might not hurt, but they also might not help. So that would be a question for an admissions officer and a tough decision depending on your test score. And then whether to really submit also depends on GPA. There's kind of a sliding scale of GPA and test scores, especially if you're an athlete. There's that NCAA scale. Most test takers, SAT, ACT, their test scores align with their grades. That's generally the case. Now, if you have test scores that don't align, so your grades are great, but your test scores are lower, maybe you're not going to benefit from sending your scores. That's logical. And if you're like me, where your grades were pretty good, but not amazing, but your test scores were solid and better than your grades, maybe that'll help, right? That'll help me get into some schools and get some scholarships because my grades were just pretty good, but my test scores were very good, right? So that can make a difference if your test scores are higher and you're a good test taker. And then just back to the STEM for a moment, not all 1400s are created equal. So if you have a perfect math score, but your scores are 1400 overall, well, applying to engineering, I'm going to send it. 800 in math looks great. We don't care about the verbal because it's engineering. Whereas if it's a different program and we've got, or if it's engineering and you've got 600 math, 800 verbal, well, that 1400 is not submittable because the math score is maybe below the range that they want. And they'll care about verbal, even though it's great you got a perfect. And then as you consider whether to submit or not, if you do submit a score on a college application, remember that the admissions offices can't unsee that. You generally do not have to submit all test scores, right? So taking an ACT and getting a bad score or getting lower than you thought you would isn't a big deal. There's very much almost no ill effect. But if then you submit it on your application, right, that would be silly. So if you know their range is 25 to 28 and you scored a 20, there's no reason to send that to a test optional college, right? Leave it off. And then again, treat each school differently. So you don't, this is a big change, but you don't have to submit or withhold all scores from all schools. You can decide to send or not send. If you're doing a common app, which means you're applying to like 5 schools or more at a time, only include the scores if you're okay with it going to all of those schools. Otherwise, send them separately to some of those schools. And as we reach the end, just a few examples. So if you do have questions, I see a couple up here, please feel free to submit those. Here's an example of just if you were working with your student or your college counselor to try to figure out, should I submit my scores or not? So an example at Swarthmore is the middle ranges for verbal and math are 680 to 750. So that means if you got like a 700 on verbal, you're in the range. If you got a 600, maybe not. If you got a 720 or above, we're in great shape. Math, anything below a 700 is lower than most admitted students last year. So if I have above a 700, especially if it's like 720, 730, that's appealing. That's something I'll submit. If I have like a 700 or below, maybe not. Right, so those are the things to look at. We're talking about quartiles. That's how you'll usually see it listed if you just Google Swarthmore SAT score percentile, right, or SAT score admissions. You'll see the second and third quartile, which are like the decision zones. If you're in the top or second quartile of scores, submit them. They will help your application. Third or bottom, probably not. Bottom, definitely not. Right, but that 25th to 50th could be a gray area. I think most counselors would tell you, no, don't submit those. And then the data aren't perfect, so you may just have to go and look back 5, 6 years or more. So there are certain schools that have gotten way, way more competitive, a lot of them, like Georgia and like Penn. So score ranges have now gone up for students who do submit test scores. The ranges are up. And a score that might have gotten you into UGA 5, 10 years ago might not now. As evidenced by this. I mean, these changes in just a year are pretty insane. But the middle quartiles are now like in the 95th percentile at Georgia. Right? This is not the top of the top. They're getting perfect scores. This is like the 25th to 75th percentile of admitted students. And same with Boston. Right? So like, man, a 32 on the ACT might not be good enough to get into BU anymore. And it's certainly not good enough for Penn, which now is basically like a perfect score or bust if you're submitting a test score. And that's an outlier because it's Penn, it's an Ivy. And last slide, I believe, just some ranges that shifted even from 2020 to 21. These are the middle quartiles. So in 2020 at Emory, if you were between a 1390 and a 1510, you were pretty likely to get in, right? Or most of the students were in that range. That has shifted up 60 or 40 points on the bottom and top part of that range. So now you got to have more like a 1500. You can see all these other examples. The big takeaway there is test optional has caused more applicants for more schools. It's also caused score ranges for colleges to go up. So test scores are even more competitive. And it's made it more strategic when it comes to deciding whether to submit scores or not. We're going to launch a quick poll. Again, our 3 cornerstones are tutoring, test prep, and EF coaching. Feel free to reach out to Appruth if you have any questions. There's an email here and a phone number, and you can see that poll just launched. And we've got several minutes for questions, so I'm just going to open it up for that. All right, so first is nice comment. You're welcome for the meeting. Glad it's been helpful. The question is, if the students will be taking the SAT digitally, do they have the option of a paper SAT? The answer is no. So like internationally now, I have a student in Madrid and she can only take on this Saturday a computer-based test. There is no paper option. And as of March of next year for SAT, there will be no paper option at all. There will be a lot of accommodations, so bigger text and colors and a lot of time accommodations. But no, once it goes digital, it's all digital, which could be problematic for some people for sure. So no, once we switch, ACT still paper, SAT still paper until March of next year. PSAT is switching to digital in October. And I'll give you my email here, but yes. Yeah, if you guys want it, reach out to info@appruth.com or that phone number, or go to the website. Ton of information there. And yeah, I just sent you my direct email. Next question is, how would students, oh good, so on the digital SAT, I'm assuming, how would students be able to annotate work and show their work, such as for like language arts and math short answers. So you will have scratch paper for math and for reading. The passages are shorter. So the tools that I've seen are, you can highlight the text on the computer, you can zoom in. Note taking is quite a bit harder. So you'd have to like take a note on your scratch paper. And I think that would be tough. But for math, that's perfectly fine. And yeah, it's different as a tutor because we do talk a lot about taking notes and active reading. And when you're doing it on a screen, that's a completely different ballgame. So yeah, I think that that's something that's still a work in progress. There are a lot of tools digitally, but I think we're going to be on the cutting edge of that and help students master it. I think it's going to be an adjustment because most of our strategies for reading are based on using your pencil and actively reading. Yeah, good questions. And we're rolling out a lot of stuff about the digital SAT. Alparuth is probably in the next couple months. So there'll be presentations, and I'm sure we'll start doing online groups. And I'm doing already a lot of tutoring for that privately. So I'm sure that's coming down the pike. All right, seeing no more questions, please feel free to reach out to us with more. You see the email and phone number below. Oh, I do see one more. Oh, does the exam have to be on the computer or can we use an iPad? For right now, the digital test will be in computer labs. So like at some point you would think you can take it in home, but the privacy technology isn't there yet in security. So right now it's like in computer labs at the school, people go in. So, and there've been some issues with that with like proctors or internet or the Blue Book app not working. But yeah, there's a lot of information on the College Board website about it, and even quite a bit of practice that they've put out. All right. Thank you so much. And there's calendars of future events on the Alparuth website. You should also get emails to it. And if you fill out that quiz, I'm sure Alparuth would send info about future presentations. I really appreciate you all joining and hope you have a wonderful rest of the evening.